our deep dive on Charles Darwin. You might think you know who he is, but stick with us because you might be surprised at how relevant Darwin is to all of us even today. So to get started, we've got a bunch of different sources on Darwin we're going to be looking at. We have some study guides, there are a couple of biographies, and we even found this really cool video script about Darwin. And so I think by looking at all these different sources together, we'll be able to see Darwin as both like a brilliant scientist, but also like a real person, kind of a flawed human being.
Yeah, I think what really drew me to Darwin is that his path to like his scientific discoveries, it wasn't like a straight line. There were like all these twists and turns in his life, and he had to overcome so many different challenges. And that to me makes his story even more like compelling.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a good place to jump in is with probably the biggest thing that happened to Darwin, which is the voyage of the HMS Beagle. It's like kind of crazy how he even got on this voyage. He's only 22. It wasn't even meant for him. Like, talk about luck.
Right. It's like imagine how different things would have been if he hadn't gotten that one lucky break. So the Beagle set sail in 1831. And over the next 5 years, Darwin got to see just the incredible diversity of life on Earth firsthand. I mean, he was documenting everything from rock formations to all the different plants and animals he encountered. He even wrote about his interactions with the different people he met along the way.
Yeah, our sources really emphasize how this voyage transformed Darwin's whole view of the world. It wasn't just about collecting data. It was making him challenge everything he thought he knew.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the key turning points for him was when they reached South America. So Darwin's looking at these layers of rock, and he's finding all these fossils. And it starts to make him question this idea of a static and unchanging Earth, like the prevailing view at the time. Everyone thought that the Earth had always been the way it was. But Darwin's observations were suggesting otherwise.
And then, of course, there's the Galapagos Islands. It's almost like nature created the Galapagos Islands just for Darwin to test his theories.
Right.
He sees these finches with beaks that are perfectly adapted to whatever food they eat on their particular island. You have tortoises with shells that are different shapes depending on which island they're on. It's like nature was putting on a show for him.
It's true. It's like nature was giving him a guided tour of evolution. But even with all that, it's not like Darwin had this sudden eureka moment in the Galapagos.
No.
It was more like the beginning of a really long process for him. He spent years thinking about these variations he was seeing, trying to figure out what was driving them.
So is this when he started developing his idea of natural selection?
Yeah. Well, it was definitely a key piece of the puzzle. But it wasn't until much later that his theory fully came together. So something that Darwin had always been really interested in was this idea of selective breeding, where humans deliberately breed animals for specific traits. Think about how dog breeders create all these different breeds. They choose which dogs to breed together based on the traits they want to see in the offspring, like size or coat color. And over generations, those desired traits become more and more prominent. And Darwin started to see parallels between this and what he had observed in the Galapagos.
So basically, he's realizing that nature could be doing something similar to what humans are doing with selective breeding. But instead of humans choosing which traits are passed on, it's the environment that's doing the selecting.
Right, exactly. So those finches with beaks that were best suited for the food sources on their specific island, they were the ones who were most likely to survive and therefore reproduce and pass on those advantageous traits to their offspring.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And this whole process is what Darwin called natural selection. It's like survival of the fittest. The individuals who are best adapted to their environment, they have a higher chance of surviving and passing on their traits. And over time, this leads to gradual changes in a species.
It's amazing to think that he was putting all this together just from observing these finches.
Yeah, it really is remarkable. But here's the thing. Even though he was developing this revolutionary idea, Darwin hesitated to share it publicly for over 20 years.
Wow. I mean, can you imagine having this knowledge, this discovery that could change the world, and just keeping it to yourself for 2 decades?
Yeah, I mean, he must have been going through so much internal conflict. He knew that his theory would challenge some deeply held religious beliefs, especially in Victorian England, where religion was so central to people's lives.
And speaking of religious beliefs, our sources mention that Darwin himself struggled with his faith.
He did. I mean, his findings were directly contradicting the creationist view that was so prevalent at the time. So it wasn't just an intellectual dilemma for him. It was a personal struggle, this inner turmoil. And that's actually part of the reason why he delayed publishing his work for so long. He was afraid of the backlash.
And then on top of all that, You have Alfred Russel Wallace entering the
Well,
picture.
yeah, that's a whole other story.
Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. So Wallace was working completely independently of Darwin, and he had basically come up with the same theory of evolution through natural selection.
Wow.
I know, it's crazy, right? So Darwin receives this letter from Wallace outlining his findings, and it's like this huge wake-up call for him. He realizes that if he doesn't publish his work soon, someone else is going to get credit for his discovery.
So in 1859, On the Origin of Species is finally published. And I'm guessing it didn't exactly go unnoticed.
Oh, yeah. It definitely made some waves. I mean, making waves is putting it mildly. On the Origin of Species, like, totally ignited this firestorm of debate and controversy. It was huge. And it's still going on today. Darwin basically, like, shifted our entire understanding of life on Earth, but it came at a personal cost.
Yeah, the sources really show how Darwin was. He wasn't just like this scientific superstar. He was a husband and a father.
Yeah.
And he dealt with some really difficult stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that really struck me was how deeply affected he was by the death of his daughter, Annie.
Yeah.
It was like it intensified his doubts about religion, and it really shaped his whole perspective on life and death.
It's just heartbreaking. And then you have Emma, his wife.
Right.
She's like this amazing presence in his life.
Oh, totally. I mean, can you imagine being married to someone whose work is like challenging the very core of your belief system?
Yeah.
And yet Emma was so supportive of Darwin, despite their different views. She was there for him emotionally. She was an intellectual companion. She even helped him edit his manuscripts.
It's a beautiful thing.
Mm.
But, Origin may have like revolutionized science, but it also led to some pretty messed up interpretations of Darwin's ideas.
Oh, yeah. You're talking about social Darwinism.
Exactly.
Ugh. It's like the worst possible misapplication of natural selection.
Like taking survival of the fittest and using it to justify social inequality and racism.
Exactly. And even eugenics.
Yeah.
It's so important to remember that Darwin himself never endorsed any of this stuff. In fact, he was horrified by it.
Yeah, it's like this reminder that even the best scientific discoveries can be twisted and used for evil purposes.
Absolutely. It's a cautionary tale.
So we have Darwin, the brilliant scientist, Darwin, the grieving father, and Darwin, whose work was both celebrated and totally distorted.
It's a lot.
A pretty complicated legacy.
It really is. But you know what? I think it's a testament to how powerful his ideas were, because they're still being debated and discussed today. I mean, think about the arguments about teaching evolution in schools.
Yeah. Or the ethical questions around genetic engineering.
It's all connected back to Darwin in some way.
It is.
So it's clear that Darwin had this huge impact on science. But I think it's interesting to look at some of the other sides of him, too.
Totally.
Like, did you know about the Glutton Club?
Oh, yeah, the Glutton Club.
Tell me about that.
So apparently when he was in college, Darwin and his buddies had this club where they would try to eat like the weirdest meats they could find.
Like, what kind of meats are we talking about?
I mean, they ate hawks, owls, who knows what else.
Wow.
It's kind of a funny story. Like, even brilliant minds have their strange hobbies.
And speaking of strange hobbies, did you know that Darwin was terrified of public speaking?
Really?
Yeah.
That's ironic. The guy who, like, revolutionized our understanding of life couldn't stand the thought of talking in front of people.
Yeah, I guess everyone has their insecurities.
That's true.
But maybe the most surprising thing about Darwin is that he spent, like, almost 40 years studying earthworms.
Wow.
I know, right?
40 years. And get this. His book on earthworms actually outsold Origin while he was alive.
Seriously, that's amazing.
He's kind of random.
It does, but I think it just goes to show how deeply curious he was. He wasn't just interested in the big flashy discoveries. He was fascinated by even the smallest, most seemingly insignificant creatures.
He just wanted to understand everything.
Exactly.
It's like after figuring out evolution, he decided to devote himself to understanding the humble earthworm.
It's pretty inspiring.
Yeah, it really makes you think, what earthworm projects do we all have in our own lives? It might seem small or silly, but if we really took the time to understand it, maybe there's something really important there.
That's a great point. I mean, Darwin's whole life is like this lesson in paying attention, really observing and being willing to appreciate the complexity of even like the simplest things.
So as we're wrapping up our deep dive into Darwin, what would you say are like the key takeaways?
That's a good question. I think first and foremost, we have to remember that Darwin was a brilliant scientist. I mean, he totally revolutionized our understanding of life, But he was also just a person. He had his own struggles and doubts,
Yeah.
He lost a child, he dealt with societal pressures, he even wrestled with the implications of his own work. It wasn't always easy for him.
I think it's also important to remember that Darwin was all about curiosity.
Yes.
He never stopped questioning,
Never.
and he was always looking for connections between things.
He saw the world as this interconnected web,
Mhm.
and I think that's something we can all learn from.
Especially today,
Oh, absolutely.
with climate change and all the advancements of biotechnology.
Like Darwin's work is more relevant now than ever.
So yeah, it's been a fascinating journey exploring the life and work of Charles Darwin. If you want to learn more, be sure to check out the sources we used for this deep dive. You'll find links to them in the show notes.
And the next time something sparks your curiosity, embrace that Darwinian spirit. Observe, question, explore. You never know what you might discover.
Until next time, keep exploring and stay curious.